After 33 years of relentless pursuit of the truth and accountability, the family of anti-apartheid activist Nokuthula Simelane will finally see justice done, because on the 8th of February 2016, the National Prosecuting Authority announced that it would charge 4 former apartheid security policemen with her kidnapping and murder. This is significant and a historic development, Mkhaya, which has been welcomed by the Simelane family. Although the Truth and Reconciliation Committee or Commission recommended that more than 300 cases should be prosecuted, this is the only one that has so far been pursued by the NPA as a result of the persistence of the Simelane family. It is the first prosecution of the apartheid-era perpetrators since 2007 plea bargain agreement was struck with former Police Minister Adrian Vlok and 4 senior police officers. I'm joined in studio by Yasmin Sooka, and she's the former TRC Commissioner and Director of the Foundation for Human Rights. Good evening to you, Yasmin, and thank you so much for honoring us with your presence.
Good evening, and good evening to all your listeners.
I'm also joined by Angela Mudukuthi, and I'm sure you remember her from the previous occasion when we had her. Mkhaya, good evening to you, Angela, and so very nice to see you again.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
I'm also joined on the line by Thembi Nkadimeng, who's the sister and the driver, one of the drivers to the success, because it's not just a success, I would submit, for the family, but it is a success for this country when we take active measures to find closure in some of the matters that we've left outstanding. Thembi, good evening to you and welcome to the Law Report.
Thank you very much, and good evening to the listeners.
We talk about your sister, and a lot of us don't know who she is. Would you just give us an idea of who she is, and because it would seem to me that she remains an activist even after her passing?
I think so. I think my sister has to die in so many ways. But she was a child born in Bethal and bred by my late father, Matthew, my mom, who's still in Bethal. She got educated in Swaziland. My mom's family originated in Swaziland. And in the midst of the process, responded to a call that every young child at the time was responding to join the MK forces with the intention of separating.
Okay, we seem to have a bad line. Are you there, Thembi?
Yeah, can you hear me?
We're having a little bit of a struggle. Let's try one more time, otherwise we'll have to hang up and call you again. All right, we're having a terrible line. We're going to try to bring Thembi Nkadimeng, because this is a very, this is an important background for you, Mkhaya, because she's, this is her sister we're talking about, and she is somebody who has worked so hard to get us as a country to where we are. One of the things that I want to talk to Yasmin Sooka about is her view on what we've seen over the last couple of weeks about all this racism tension that we're seeing, and with a lot of it being so unnecessary, and the relationship between what the Simelane family seeks to do. But let me bring in Yasmin Sooka and maybe just talk about your experiences, where we are insofar as this matter is concerned. And I'm most interested about, and I think to give the listeners a perspective, what happened to Thembi's sister?
I think it's important that we go back to the period of transition,
yeah,
and the negotiations. And of course, as the Archbishop said, there was no real victor in the conflict in South Africa. And one of the last issues that held up the signing of the interim constitution was really this question of what would we do with those who perpetrated human rights violations in South Africa. And people speak very poetically about, at the stroke of midnight, there was this agreement that there would be an amnesty. But of course, the important thing was that the parties then, who realized that they were not yet really the legitimate enough to say what the content of that should be, said, when the new government is elected, then we will define what the terms of the amnesty are going to be. Now, at that point, civil society was confronted with this question of, do they agree to this? Do they participate? How should they respond? Because many believed that the right thing to do was to follow the Nuremberg-style trials. But eventually, a coalition of about 50 NGOs and, of course, the churches who had been at the forefront of the struggle, they decided that they would participate in this process of looking at how you would define the law. And as a result of that, we had this amnesty law, which became a part of the search for the truth in the form of the Promotion of National Unity and Reconciliation Act, which was passed after 1 year of consultations in South Africa. Now, normally when you commit international crimes of this nature, you go to prison, and you go to prison usually for a long time, as we've seen with the Nazi Holocaust trials, even as late as last week.
Absolutely.
Somebody who was 90 years old was indicted and is going to stand trial. In our country, what we chose to do is that there would be this amnesty process. You would come forward by way of application. You would make full disclosure of the crime you had committed. And in return, if you were able to prove that in fact you had made full disclosure and that you had conducted this or committed this in pursuit of a political party or the former state, then you would get amnesty. And getting amnesty meant you would not be prosecuted, you would not go to jail. And if you were already in jail, you would in fact be released from prison, which happened in quite a lot of instances. But of course, if you didn't, the law said that you should be prosecuted if you did not make full disclosure, and in fact, if amnesty had been refused. Now, of course, the Commission ended its work. The first set of reports, 1998. The second set, 2003. And what one would have anticipated is that the NPA would have immediately moved into beginning the question of prosecutions. Instead, what we had was a long period of what I would call hostility and obfuscation. And in fact, when the first prosecutorial guidelines emerged, they were in fact tantamount to another amnesty and really contrary to the commitment of the TRC legislation. And so what then began was a pursuit through the courts, really, of getting the NPA to commit to a proper set of guidelines. But nevertheless, despite the many consultations we had with them, we were unable to get a commitment to prosecute either this case or any one of the other 300 cases, not even in investigation. And in fact, it was at that point, I think in 2005, when Thembi approached us, and we then began to look at pressurizing. I think we went through about 3 national directors of prosecutor of the prosecution office, and in fact quite a few ministers of justice. And I think it's really the tenacity of Thembi and her family that have got us to this point. I think what very few people know is that Thembi herself actually visited each one of the people who are who were part of the amnesty application, and she tried at that point to get them to tell her the truth. And of course, they all refused. So they've had something like 16 years in which, if they wanted to come forward and make disclosure without the idea of prosecutions, they could have done so. So I think that we also had to hire a private investigator in the form of Frank Dutton, who had worked on the trust feeds case. Nokuthula, of course, was the subject of an abduction by what we know as the Soweto Death Squad, and she was actually kidnapped in the Carlton Centre. She was taken to a particular farmhouse, and there she was tortured and, we believe, finally murdered. Now, at the time, Nokuthula's mother and father, I think they went around for a long period, even before the Truth Commission was in fact established. And they actually put out a story asking for people to come forward if they knew about Nokuthula's whereabouts. And so in 1983, this article appeared in the city press, and as a result of that, one of the policemen who had been part of this death squad actually came forward and told them about what had happened. And what you had then, of course, which is very interesting, was an investigation that was already being conducted. So by the time the Truth Commission began its hearings, a docket actually existed. But what was very interesting is that docket was not made available to the Truth Commission. And so when these policemen applied for amnesty, that docket was not made available. And so in fact, these policemen, they were split down the middle, and two of them, I mean, there were quite a few Askaris, and I think all of your listeners will know that Askaris were originally members of the liberation movement who were then forced to turn and become traitors and spies in the employ of the former state. And so the Askaris in this team, who had been part of the luring of Nokuthula into the strap, the arrest and the abduction really, they actually came forward and they said that, she'd been kidnapped, she'd been taken to the farmhouse, and that she had been so brutally tortured, and that they believed that, in fact, she had been killed by the white security branch policemen. They also said that, in fact, one of the policemen actually said to them that she had been killed. Now, this was, of course, at odds with the white security policemen who alleged that, in fact, she had been released and that they believed that they had turned her into a spy, and in fact that she had gone back to Swaziland. Now, if you look at the common pattern of almost all of the cases of abduction, even the case of Stanza Poppy is another one that comes to mind, what the police always allege, or the death squads allege, is that, yes, they were abducted, we managed to turn them into spies, but they went back and they rejoined the ANC. And so the Amnesty Committee, when they heard this, in fact, only gave two of the policemen, the two black Askaris, they gave them amnesty. And they said in the case of the other applicants that they had not told the truth. And in fact, the inference there was that, in fact, these cases should be followed up with to the point of where you would prosecute them. Now, of course, you've had this intervening period of almost, I think, 16 years. And this is really the 20th year of the Truth Commission having been set up in the country. And so, it's taken many, many years. And really, I think the work of people like Thembi and her family, Howard Varney, the attorney who in fact acted, he's an advocate, and he really took this matter up with the NPA. And of course, through all of our support, we were able to hire a private investigator to reconstruct this file and really put a case before the NPA, which is in fact something that you can't really set aside. And what we've been doing is contemplating what our options should be. I mean, it's taken us, I think, the last 3 years since the last interaction with the NPA, and I think there was a question, do we go for a mandamus and force them to prosecute? Do we ask for a declaration? Do we actually ask for a judicial inquest? And I think, thankfully, and I think we're all very grateful to Sean Abrams and his team, that he's finally said, we're going to actually prosecute. But I think one of the things we need to remember is that this is not just an ordinary crime. This is a crime committed in the context of a conflict. It constitutes what we call a crime against humanity. And so while we may have the indictments of these men, there's a bigger question that we need to ask. This was systematic, it was planned, it was carried out with the support of a state that had in fact set up death squads. So who's the leadership here? At what point are they going to be prosecuted as well? And of course, when you look at the question of a crime against humanity, in most countries there is now a normative framework. A state has an obligation to investigate, to prosecute, and to furnish not only the individual victims and their families with the truth, but it owes an obligation to us as a society to tell us about how this happened and how it was possible and who was responsible. So I think that we're at a very critical point in the juncture of our political life. You asked the question, how is it linked to what we are seeing today? I think many people in our country said, were we too easy? Did we forgive too easily? And in fact, what has been the commitment from the other side? You've heard someone like the Archbishop say, people are ungrateful. And of course, many white people in our country say, we've had the TRC, let's move on. But who can move on. Only those who are at an economic level who are able to can move on. For the rest of our society, they remain trapped in the poverty. I mean, this is a country which sits at the highest level of poverty and inequality. We sit at the top of all countries in terms of the Gini coefficient. And if there's one critique I have of the way in which we did our work, is we focused on the civil and political rights violations, in other words, the murder, the torture, the abductions. But one of the questions which we were constantly confronted with is, what did apartheid mean in terms of the real crime against humanity? And that's the land dispossession, all of the socioeconomic rights violations.
The truth shall set you free. What a small price to pay for your amnesty after killing a person or murdering an individual. Let me go back to Thembi Nkadimeng, and hopefully the line is better. Thembi, let's try that again, shall we?
Yes, how is it?
Good, thank you. You were still telling us about the life and times of your sister, Nokuthula Simelane.
Well, I was just saying she was born and bred in Betal. Raised by my grandmother in Swaziland, where she received her education. At the time of her adoption, she was due to graduate for a BA in administration with the University of Swaziland. And she had joined the African National Congress, the military wing, Umkhonto weSizwe, to assist as a courier in terms of transmitting of information between Swaziland and South Africa. And as Yasmin has explained, she was captured in one of her missions in Carlton Center, where she met with an unknown Askari at the time, and it led to her abduction, kidnapping, torture, and ultimately the court case that we're trying to deal with to finally establish how was she murdered.
Let me talk to Angela Mudukuthi, and we've spoken to her before on the show, and I just want to get your organization's input and how do you come into this whole scenario?
So as Yasmin has said, we've been supporting Thembi Nkadimeng throughout this process, and really our role came into finding the crystallization of the legal process, which for us was compelling the NPA to either A, make a decision to prosecute, or B, institute a judicial inquest, both of which they had refused to do up until that point. And so in May 2015, we filed our papers, and interestingly enough, the NDPP and the Minister of Justice filed their papers to oppose the case. But at the same time, that triggered the NDPP bringing the family back to the negotiation table. And I think ultimately the legal papers we filed compelling them to take a decision is what has triggered their decision to prosecute today. It's been a long road, and as Yasmin has explained, there's a long background, but I think it really crystallized in those moments where they were faced with legal papers and with the prospect of having to air their dirty laundry in court. So as Yasmin has said, we are grateful to the NDPP. He's taken a decision that no one before him was willing or able to take, depending on how you look at things. But I mean, really, it is 33 years is too long to wait for justice.
Agreed. I want to bring you back, Yasmin. You were talking about the distinction between what is currently happening, and you drew a distinction between ordinary murder and a crime against humanity. Please take me through that.
Well, and obviously murder would be a crime in terms of our statutes, and I think you heard your legal
criminal,
rights.
yes.
Criminal lawyer go through the sort of distinction.
So I suppose at the heart of my question is it your submission that this is a matter that should not be dealt with within the confines of the South African jurisdiction? It should actually be prosecuted elsewhere?
No, what I'm saying is that it should be prosecuted as a political or international crime.
Right.
And of course, there is no prescription on international crimes. And the crimes that we talk about are what we call, we talk about a crime against humanity. And in this case, what we're dealing with is what we would call not just an abduction or a kidnapping, but really an enforced disappearance. And in fact, that would already raise the question of a presumption that those that Nokuthula Simelane were last in the custody of would have the primary onus or responsibility for explaining what happened to her. And then secondly, we are not just talking about an ordinary murder. We are talking about a killing in terms of international law. And that in terms of the Rome Statute would mean that we are looking at the systemic nature, the intent with which this crime was carried out. And here, we're not talking just about a simple murder. We're talking about the fact that you have a death squad that was involved.
Yeah.
They are linked to, I think, almost around 18 other cases. This is just one of them. And what we want to get to is not just the individual crime, but we want to understand how is it that this squad was able to operate with such impunity.
Yeah.
Who gave the instructions? Who allowed this to be set up?
Who made it so organized?
And then we talk about, where does the command responsibility for this lie? Does it lie with this leadership of this ordinary police group? Does it go higher? Who are the generals involved? Were the politicians at any way directly linked to the kind of decision making that was taken? And that's the kind of exposure we would hope to see when this case is finally prosecuted. And in fact, South Africa is different from many other countries, because not only have we adopted the Rome Statute, but we've also domesticated it under South African law.
Yeah.
And if you remember that there is no prescription on this kind of crime, then of course it's quite possible that we can prosecute it as an international crime.
And Thembi, Nkadimeng, can I please bring you back in here? What is your hope going forward? I mean, we heard from Yasmin all your efforts to get to the truth, all of which have failed. Now that we are here, what is your hope?
I think my hope is twofold. One is to find closure and be able to afford Nokuthula a dignified send-off. But my ultimate wish is that no other woman, no other mother goes through what my mom has gone through. So that talks to the 18 that is involved, the other families who are also hoping that out of Nokuthula's case, they will also find justice. That talks to the over 300 cases that are sitting still at the NPA, where all families are still hoping for justice. We are saying, as the Simelane family, justice delayed for them is justice denied for them, as well as it has been for us. And I think it will not be a victory on behalf of Nokuthula if only it's her case that is dealt with. We were not doing this on our behalf. We were doing it on behalf of all those South Africans who have been let down by the justice system.
Yasmin, what do you say to some views that we hear? And perhaps this conversation is so captivating. I'm talking this evening to Thembi Nkadimeng, who's a sister of Nokuthula Simelane. I'm also talking to Yasmin Sooka, former TRC Commissioner and Director of the Foundation for Human Rights. And also joining me in studio is Angela Mudukuthi, who's the International Criminal Justice Lawyer at the South African Litigation Centre. And the story is centered around this issue of the prosecution of one of 300 individuals that were recommended for prosecution flowing from the TRC. And I want to just play you some audio of another individual that was involved in the prosecution, and that is Advocate Dumisani Ntebeza.
Do you think that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was a worthwhile effort? I think the answer to that is yes, but then yes and no. We made recommendations. One of the recommendations was that those who did not meet the requirements of the amnesty section must be prosecuted. Dalcy September's name was mentioned. There are 101 other cases. In fact, there is one case which is a very curious one, and that is about the PEPCO 3, the people who were snatched from, disappeared literally, from Port Elizabeth Airport, and we have never come to know what happened to them. Now, the people who were killed, those three, applied for amnesty. They were denied amnesty. There was an application by them to review the decision of the Amnesty Committee. I was instructed by the interim Minister of Justice at that time, who was now Deputy Minister of Education, to lead the legal team and oppose that application for review. I was instructed by the State Attorney I was with Ngalwana. We pleaded we did all the pleadings, but that case has never been set down. I think it's now going for its 4th year. And you ask yourself the question, why does the state attorney not set the matter down when all the pleadings are closed? It's a big question. I even wrote to the then Minister of Justice to say, I don't understand why this matter is not being dealt with. I think we should not talk in hushed tones about this apparent coexistence or indication of a deal between the old order and the new order. I think the time has come now. And this prosecution, if it says anything else, it should be a prosecution that should lead to the prosecutions for the murderers of Steve Biko, the PEPCO 3, the Crack Dog 4, and I'm just mentioning a few of the cases that have not been resolved.
That was the voice of Advocate Thembi, and he's talking about a possible deal between the new order and the old order. Angela, what is your take on that?
I think it's a very interesting point to highlight, and this clip that you played is from a press conference we hosted last week where he reiterated that there has been some political interference with these cases. And you will see from the court papers we filed in May 2015 seeking to compel the NPA to make a decision, we have sworn affidavits from former NDPP Vusi Pikoli and former head of the Priority Crimes Litigation Unit, Anton Ackerman, testifying to this political interference and the fact that they were prohibited from taking these cases and similar cases to the next level. So I think there's a very interesting discussion and issue there that needs to be unpacked.
I want to go back to another audio clip and I want us to just chat about that.
There are just a few things that one wants to emphasize. The first one is that there is a need to inquire into the kinds of arrangements, for lack of a better word, that could have been struck between those who represented the new order and those who represented the old order. Because this is not a coincidence. And I'll give you 2 examples. The first one is the one that has since then been confirmed by Vusi Pikoli. We were always of the view at that time, and it has now been confirmed, that there was political interference with the decision to prosecute. I mean, the law was clear. The Amnesty Act, so-called Promotion of National Unity and Reconciliation Act, was very clear in its provisions. There was a period within which those who ought to have applied for amnesty were to apply. Within that period, if you didn't and you missed the boat, then if there was evidence, and there was plenty of evidence, then you would be prosecuted. But we know that I think there were only 2 successful post-apartheid prosecutions. One by Mahaga, incidentally, who prosecuted 2 ex-Transkei police securities, Kumengu and Kyani. And the successful prosecution at that, those guys were sentenced to 20 years. In fact, it was the irony that it was a former Bandustan that in our democracy prosecuted successfully. And in fact, Maga, when he came to the Justice Department, he was busy inquiring with Ackerman of ways to prosecute those who murdered my cousin Batanda Ndondo. So there were people within the national prosecuting authorities who were quite keen to pursue these prosecutions. But there must have been a systemic resistance to these prosecutions.
Once again, that's the voice of Advocate Thembi, also making the point and talking about Nokuthula Simelane. And I think together, firstly, before the end of the show, I want to congratulate all of you for having come this far. But you still got some distance to cover. What can we look forward to, or at least what are your hopes going forward?
You know, I see Nokuthula's case as emblematic of all the other cases. And if we can open this one, then what we begin to lay the ground for is accountability on all of the other unresolved cases. Dumissus spoke about the Pepco case, the Craddock 4 case. He also raised the question of Steve Biko. We're looking at 2 other cases, the Timor case, the Agate case. And of course, we've also done an analysis of the amnesty applications, and we've brought this down to at least 27 cases that we could pursue almost immediately. And so it's going to be very, very important for us to monitor what happens in the Simelane case, but at the same time begin to build, I think, a broad commitment to beginning to deal with the other cases. You know, imagine you have Nokuthula's father died, and if you go back to the TRC footage, you will see him testifying both in the human rights violations committee, as well as before the amnesty committee. But he died before he could see any kind of justice being done. Now, imagine that's the case for so many families in our country. And of course, it's something that is owed to us, because one of the things we need to look at is, where are all these characters? Some of them are still in the police. What does it do? Does it influence other torture that takes place? How deeply
Because we do know that torture still takes place.
How deeply entrenched are these structures? And, you know, it makes a mockery of the TRC process for some to have come forward and made full disclosure. I mean, the one person who went to jail was Eugene de Kock. Should he be the only one? The fact is that when Adrian Flock plea bargained, he didn't make any full disclosure. And all of that makes a mockery of this intense compromise that our country, in fact, went through. And so I think it's a very pivotal moment in the history of our country. It's like Argentina and Chile, where it took 20 years after their truth commissions to arrive at the point where they prosecute. So I would hope to see that in South Africa, justice will be done in our country. Justice to the victims and the survivors, and justice to our society.
Angela Mudukuthi?
I have to echo exactly what Yasmin had said, but also to add that I think if we're really going to give power and a voice to the Constitution and rule of law and all those principles the South African society espouses to, then this case is pivotal, and cases like it as well. Because although the Constitution is an amazing document, but it's just a document if we don't take matters like this seriously. And I think this case, as Yasmin has said, is pivotal and will change things, and hopefully for the better, because if South Africa is truly to move on and truly, we talk about the new South Africa, but if we're truly to give that any meaning, then these cases can't be left alone. They must be dealt with.
Do you think that for somebody to go on social media and call a whole nation monkeys by virtue of them being of a different race, do you think that what we're embarking on, at least what you guys are doing now, will go some way at dealing with some of those things? Because I think the other thing is, my shock at that was not that she said it, but the fact that you thought it was okay to say it. I think it's one thing to feel something, but to live in a country where you think you can say that and have your friends and family and neighbors think, it's all right.
When the Truth Commission began its hearings, we began with the human rights violations hearings. And in fact, when the victims started to speak, many white South Africans said, they're lying, these things can't be true. But when they actually heard the perpetrators come before the amnesty committee, and in fact it was a lot worse than the victims knew, then white South Africa said, we didn't know that these things were happening. And of course, I think that's not where the discussion should end. It should really be about, how could these things have happened without us taking some form of responsibility? There's a huge question around restitution, around reparation, and we have not seen many people come forward and say, how do we, who were the beneficiaries of apartheid, make reparations?
Because that's actually truly the starting point, a recognition that you are a beneficiary. Despite your ignorance, which may be true or not.